Something happened on Sunday, Monday the 5th, 2026, that hasn't fully entered the public conversation yet, but it should, because Russia didn't just comment on the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, it moved openly, deliberately, and in a way that immediately rippled through both energy markets and military planning circles. And this wasn't just about oil, it touched something much deeper: strategic power at the highest level. Within hours, the tone shifted. Officials in Washington began reassessing naval posture in the region. In Tehran, the rhetoric escalated. Phrases like strategic deterrence began appearing more frequently. That phrase isn't casual language. In most contexts, it signals discussions that sit very close to nuclear doctrine, and that's what makes the timing so significant. Because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just another choke point, it's one of the most critical arteries in the global economy. A substantial portion of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow corridor every single day. So when a major power inserts itself directly into that space, at a moment when tensions are already elevated, you're not looking at coincidence, you're looking at intent. Whether that intent is coordination or calculated opportunism is still unclear. But either way, the effect is the same. The situation is no longer a two-player dynamic. It's becoming something far more complex, a layered confrontation involving multiple major powers, each with its own interests, constraints, and thresholds. To understand why this matters, you have to look at the moment it happened. Early morning, Monday 5th. A senior Russian official steps forward following what was described as an unscheduled security briefing and delivers a statement about ensuring stability in maritime routes alongside regional partners. On the surface, it sounds routine, but context changes everything, because almost immediately there were indications that Russian naval assets were adjusting their positions near key transit corridors leading into the strait. Not symbolic presence, operational movement. At nearly the same time, U.S. military activity in the region increased, particularly in surveillance operations. And Iran responded shortly after, warning against what it framed as external interference in regional affairs. Each response was measured, but together they formed a pattern. Markets reacted first, energy prices moved, insurance costs rose, and shipping risk calculations shifted. Behind the scenes, consultations between Western capitals began almost immediately. But the deeper significance isn't just the reaction, it's what the move represents. For decades, the structure in the Gulf followed a relatively stable pattern. The United States maintained a dominant security presence. Regional actors adjusted around that presence. Iran challenged the system, but usually within limits. And Russia, while active elsewhere, rarely positioned itself at the center of Gulf maritime dynamics. That framework shaped everything: military planning, energy pricing, diplomatic expectations. It was the baseline. What happened on May 3rd disrupted that baseline. Because Russia didn't stay on the periphery, it stepped into the core of one of the most sensitive operational spaces in the world at a moment when tensions were already elevated. And that changes the calculation. When multiple major powers, each with advanced military capabilities, begin operating in close proximity within a confined and strategically critical environment, the margin for error narrows significantly. And the risk isn't just escalation, it's miscalculation. Now, there is a narrative being presented that this move is about stabilization, about ensuring safe passage, preventing disruption, maintaining order. And on the surface, that explanation fits, but there are indications that this wasn't a last-minute response. Patterns of activity suggest preparation. Naval logistics had been increasing in the weeks prior. Movements from other regions were already underway. Communication channels with regional actors appear to have been active before the public statement was made. That points to something more deliberate, not reaction, but positioning. And positioning matters because it allows influence over outcomes, over how events unfold, over how far escalation goes, and over how other actors respond. Reports of closer coordination between Russian and Iranian military structures, whether formal or informal, add another layer. Even limited coordination can have a significant effect. It complicates decision-making for others. It introduces uncertainty. It forces hesitation. And in high-stakes environments, hesitation can shape the entire trajectory of a crisis. This is no longer just about presence. It's about leverage, which brings us to the language being used. Terms like maritime stabilization and cooperative security framework sound neutral, constructive even. But in practice, they describe something more concrete. the placement of military assets in a critical corridor, the establishment of coordination mechanisms, the ability to influence movement, who passes through, under what conditions, and with what level of risk. That's not passive, that's strategic positioning. And once that positioning is established, it becomes part of the equation going forward, because it doesn't just affect the current situation, it reshapes expectations for what comes next. Put simply, what Russia is building here is influence, not outright control, but the ability to observe, shape, and potentially disrupt a massive portion of global energy flow moving through the Strait of Hormuz. And when you're talking about a corridor that carries a significant share of the world's oil, even partial influence translates into real leverage. That's why this matters. Because under international maritime law, particularly the principle of transit passage, this route is supposed to remain open to all. No single country is meant to dominate or restrict it, but there's a gray zone. By framing their presence as cooperative security or stabilization, Russia and Iran can operate inside that space without technically crossing a legal red line. They don't have to block traffic outright, they just have to shape the conditions around it. And in practice, that's enough. Imagine a tanker departing the Gulf, heading toward Asia. As it enters the strait, it moves through an environment where Iranian forces are asserting control over nearby waters, while Russian naval units are positioned as part of a so-called stabilizing presence. No shots fired, no formal restrictions. But the uncertainty is there, and uncertainty has consequences. Insurance rates climb, transit slows, risk calculations shift, and those shifts ripple outward into global pricing, into supply chains, and into national economies. That's leverage. Not through direct confrontation, but through influence over the system itself. And once that leverage exists, it doesn't stay confined to military considerations. It becomes political. Because now decisions about energy, trade, and security are being made under a different set of assumptions. Then came the reaction. And the speed of that reaction tells you everything. From Washington, the message was immediate and firm. Senior defense officials made it clear that any interference with navigation in the strait would trigger a response. At the same time, military activity in the region increased, more surveillance, higher readiness levels, and closer monitoring of developments. This wasn't routine, it was reactive. Across Europe, the tone was more cautious, but no less concerned. Officials emphasized the risk of destabilization and warned against further militarization of key trade routes. Behind the scenes, consultations began, particularly among countries heavily dependent on energy imports. In the Gulf, the response was equally telling. Statements focused on the need to keep energy flows uninterrupted, language that reflects both economic dependence and strategic vulnerability. Regional coordination intensified, with governments reviewing security measures and monitoring the situation closely. When multiple regions respond this quickly across political, military, and economic lines, it signals something important, a shared recognition that the situation has shifted. This is no longer being treated as routine positioning. It's being treated as a potential turning point. And here's where the contrast becomes hard to ignore. Just weeks earlier, the dominant message from international forums was de-escalation. Leaders emphasized stability. They talked about keeping the strait open, secure, and free from military tension. That was the public narrative. But what we're seeing now suggests something else was happening in parallel. While those statements were being made, movements were already underway. Assets were being repositioned, coordination was taking shape, risk indicators were rising. In other words, the groundwork was already being laid, which raises a difficult question. Was the push for de-escalation a genuine effort or a cover for positioning? Because when actions and messaging diverge this sharply, it doesn't just create confusion, it erodes trust. And in a high-stakes environment like this, trust isn't a luxury, it's a stabilizing force. Without it, every move is interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Every action is seen as part of a larger strategy, and every response risks triggering the next step in a chain that becomes harder to control. That's where things stand now. Not just a buildup of forces, but a breakdown in clarity. And in a region where miscalculation carries global consequences, that combination is where risk begins to accelerate. That's not a misunderstanding. It's a contradiction, intentional, calculated, and strategic. And that's exactly why it matters. Because beyond the military movements and diplomatic messaging, this situation is really about something much bigger: influence over the global economic system. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a narrow waterway, it's one of the most critical financial arteries on the planet. A massive share of the world's oil supply, millions of barrels every single day, passes through a corridor that is, in practical terms, extremely tight for the volume it carries. That creates vulnerability, and vulnerability creates leverage. Now add another major power into that space, not watching from a distance, but actively positioning itself alongside a regional force that already operates inside the strait. The implications become immediate. Markets don't wait for disruption, they react to the risk of disruption. Even a small increase in perceived danger can move oil prices sharply. Insurance costs rise, shipping companies adjust routes, delays increase, and all of that feeds directly into the global economy. So the real question is, who benefits? Higher oil prices strengthen energy exporters. Countries already under economic pressure can offset some of that strain through increased revenue. Meanwhile, import-dependent economies feel the impact instantly: higher costs, inflation pressure, and growing political strain. The effects are not equal. And that imbalance is where the real power lies, because this isn't about completely shutting down the strait. It's about shaping the conditions under which it operates. A country doesn't need to block traffic to influence outcomes. It only needs to introduce enough uncertainty that the system begins to adjust itself. And once that adjustment begins, the impact spreads far beyond the region. It affects inflation, trade flows, and decision-making in countries thousands of miles away. That's the real story. Influence over a choke point like this translates into influence over the global system, and when multiple powers begin operating in that same space, stability becomes fragile, which brings us to the next phase, because positioning is one thing, sustaining it is something else entirely. Maintaining a coordinated presence in a narrow, high-risk maritime corridor is extremely complex. It requires constant communication, aligned procedures, and seamless coordination between forces that may not share the same systems or doctrines, and this is where friction starts to appear. Early indications suggest that even among actors currently aligned, coordination is not perfect. Communication protocols are still developing, operational integration is incomplete. That might sound technical, but in a situation like this, those details are critical, because friction creates delays, delays create uncertainty, and uncertainty in a crowded and tense environment increases the risk of miscalculation. So while the strategic picture points toward growing coordination, the operational reality is far more complicated, and that complexity is what will ultimately shape what happens next. Different command systems, different rules of engagement, and different thresholds for escalation all create one dangerous reality: room for error. And in a corridor as tight and heavily trafficked as the Strait of Hormuz, even a minor misstep doesn't stay minor for long. It compounds, it escalates, it forces reactions. That's the first layer of risk. The second is the American deterrence posture. The United States still holds overwhelming naval capability in the region, anchored by its Fifth Fleet presence in Bahrain. And that matters because it means every movement is being tracked, assessed, and, if necessary, countered almost instantly. Contingency planning is already in motion. If risk levels rise beyond certain thresholds, rapid escort operations for commercial shipping can be deployed. That creates a constant feedback loop. One side moves, the other responds, and the cycle continues in real time. It's not static, it's dynamic pressure. The third layer is political endurance, because no matter how strong a strategy looks on paper, it still has to survive domestic realities. Governments shift, public pressure builds, economic strain forces recalculation, and that applies to everyone involved. Inside Iran, different power centers don't always operate with perfect unity. In Russia's case, maintaining long-term deployments far from its primary theaters comes with real resource trade-offs. So the question isn't just whether this alignment can be built, it's whether it can last. Because projecting influence is one thing, sustaining it under continuous military, economic, and political pressure is something entirely different. Early signals suggest the effort is real, but whether it holds over time remains uncertain, which brings us to what happens next. Because we're moving out of the phase of statements and into the phase of observable actions. The next critical checkpoint is mid-May, when regional defense officials are expected to reassess maritime risk conditions in the Gulf. That review, drawing on both U.S. naval inputs and regional intelligence, will likely shape the next phase of operations in the Strait. And there are three indicators that matter most. First, whether the United States formally expands escort operations for commercial vessels. Second, how Russia adjusts its naval positioning. Does it hold steady, expand its footprint, or shift closer to key transit routes? Third, how Iran signals, whether through increased naval activity or a shift toward quieter, more calculated deterrence messaging. These signals will define the trajectory. Because if all three actors maintain or intensify their current posture, this doesn't remain a short-term crisis. It becomes a sustained, multi-actor pressure environment. But if positioning begins to ease and diplomatic channels quietly reopen, the situation could stabilize faster than expected. So what matters now is momentum. If escalation signals continue into the coming weeks, this evolves into a prolonged standoff. If they fade, markets calm and attention shifts. The window for clarity is short. The implications are not. Because what unfolded in early May wasn't just another headline, it was a structural shift in how power is being projected across one of the most critical energy corridors in the world. For decades, the pattern was relatively stable. The United States dominated maritime security. Iran applied pressure through asymmetric tactics. Russia remained largely on the periphery. That framework is now changing. We're entering a more complex environment, one where multiple major powers operate within the same confined space, with overlapping interests and limited trust. That kind of configuration is inherently unstable. And historically, moments like this don't just create temporary volatility, they signal deeper realignments. Whether this becomes a lasting shift or just another cycle of tension depends entirely on what happens next, especially in how military posture and energy security responses evolve. But one thing stands out above everything else: the speed, the fact that multiple actors adjusted their positions, messaging, and readiness within such a short window suggests a system operating with very little margin for error. And that's what makes this moment so critical. So where does it go from here? Are we looking at controlled containment or the early stages of a broader power competition? That's the question, and the answer is still unfolding.